Hello, Honkai. Good to see you. Hey, Laura.
Howdy.
How are you doing, Mike?
Hey, Honkai. I'm good. I didn't hear you clearly.
Hey there, everybody. How are you?
Yo, yo, yo. Pretty good.
All right. It looks like we already have screen share enabled, so we'll maybe give it one moment and we can go ahead and get started. Looks like there's a pretty full agenda today, so that is good. I hope you're all having a great Tuesday so far.
I don't see that screen sharing is enabled, but maybe other people do.
You're right. I need to sign in. One moment.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Howdy.
All right, let's see. Okay, sharing screen is now enabled. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the Tuesday, May 3rd, 2022 meeting of Kubernetes SIG Multicluster. First up, we have Mike here to give an update on the work API. Mike, you can go ahead and share your screen and begin whenever you're ready.
Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna get started then. Today I want to present us the work API enhancement. It's for syncing the apply workload resource status. Before I get started, I want to give a shout out to Ku Zhang, who wrote most of the proposal, and then Joshua, myself, and other contributors finish it up. So just to give a quick work API background, because it's not that popular repo, a work CRD represents a list of API resources to be deployed from a centralized location, a hub cluster, or it can be an API server, a centralized API server, to a spoke managed cluster. A work CR on the hub cluster means that the resources defined in the work will be applied on a spoke or managed cluster That was just a quick overview. You can visit the project website for more details. For this pull request enhancement, it's about the resource status sync. So in most cases, the user on the hub cluster wants to know the real-time status of a apply workload that's done on the spoke or managed cluster. So this proposal is to provide a common approach for the users on the hub cluster to collect those workloads resource statuses that was applied by the Work API. So we assume the status update frequency should be periodically, but that's more of an implementation details. The motivation for this API enhancement is the current Work API lacks the ability to collect those resource status. It only shows that, oh, your workload's been applied and that's it. So the straightforward approach is just to return the entire status of the applied workload. But it's not easy to manage these type of untyped structure object because each resource status might be different. And it's also the size of the resource status might be quite large and it will lead to scalability problems. So in most cases, the users or the controller on the hub side or a centralized location only cares about a certain fields of the applied resource status. So it might make more sense to specify which fields that you want, and then the work controller will take care of the status return. So the spec enhancement that we're proposing is under the spec, we add a workload config, and then under the workload configs might be many different types of configuration for workload. So in this instance, we add a new spec called manifest configs, and this manifest configs contain the resource identifier, which identifies the manifest that you're trying to configure, and then the status sync rules that we've been discussing. In the status sync rules, there's the sync type, and then there's the JSON path. For the sync type, we have two defined currently. There's the common fields type and then the JSON paths type. The common fields type represents hard-coded predefined JSON paths types. So for example, in deployment, there might be ready replica, available replica. So if you say that you want the type common fields, and then it'll just return those results. And then the spec enhancement example here, this is the before what we currently have under workload, and under workload config is what we're proposing of adding. We're adding a resource identifier, which represent the manifest in here, up here, and then the static sync rule. So in this case, it will return common fields, the hard-coded the status fields return, and adjacent paths that you can customize on the resource status that you want to return. Are there any questions? Let me give a quick break for now. Are there any questions regarding the spec enhancement?
So I just want to make sure that I understand correctly that the point of having the rules is so that you can have a work that encompasses X, Y, and Z resource, but you only want to see the status of X. Is that correct?
Yep, that is correct. And also specify which fields of the status that you're interested in. So you don't have to capture the whole thing.
Okay. Do you imagine programming like quasi parameters of the status update through that part of the spec too?
Yes, we briefly mentioned it in the proposal as well. So right now, the periodic timer is handled by a controller parameter. That's implementation details. But maybe if there's a feedback, like what you said, maybe we can enhance it further by adding it into the spec as well. So that also makes kind of sense.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna continue onward. So that was the spec enhancement, which tells which fields to, which resource, which manifest, and which fields to sync. And in the status is to capture the status sync return data. So we're planning to add a status sync field. It contains the sync values, and then the name and the value are, the name is the alias to the field that you're trying to capture on the resource, and the value and the field value is defined as the value of the fields that you want to return, and we want to specifically specify the integer, string, or boolean, those three common types, so that the consumer of the API have a type that they can use to reference. And then for the static enhancement, so in the manifest config, currently it only show that the apply manifest has been applied and completed. And then we're planning to add that to show the resource is available or not available, depends on the sync status. And then if the status is synced or not. So right underneath this, there's the identifier to tell, okay, which manifest is it, this status sync is for, and these conditions are for. And then this is status sync value represent the values that were synced over from the spoke cluster to the managed cluster. So those are the status changes. Before I head to continue forward, are there any other questions?
Hi, Mike. I have a question here. The field type is just for integer, string, and a boolean, right?
Yep.
How to deal with other types such as slash or map?
Yep. I guess then we should probably enhance the proposal a little bit to handle the other types as well, because I think the array and the slice is a common type as well. But for
Yes.
now, in order to capture them, you will probably transform them into a string or integer or boolean array. But I understand your concern, and that's definitely a good feedback.
Okay.
Okay, oh, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. Can we go back to slide 6 though? I think it is back within the status sync rule. Just wondering if, and apologies if this was already discussed on the proposal, but this form where each workload knows its own rules and the common fields type is kind of like, seems like a way to help out with some good defaults. Was there any thought of making it like sort of a separate policy that like selects on what workloads a certain status sync rule should be applied, so so that it's like not embedded in each individual workload? Or is that not the type of like broad policy application that you expect?
No, that is an excellent suggestion, and there have been similar suggestion in the proposal as well, where we don't specify each the rules in each spec, because it is quite cumbersome to do so. But we haven't heard. So the rules, we feel like the rules needs to be specified somewhere in the API. If it's not in this API, then it needs to be, we feel like it needs to be somewhere else, like a policy type of API. So we haven't had any good ideas yet. And I think Honkai and others also suggested something similar. And I think I suggested maybe the rules here, the spec rules here, maybe we shouldn't be applied to this this API proposal, and then we just leave it up for either implementation detail, so another spec API or another API proposal change. But we just haven't come to a conclusion or any good idea how to do that yet. but definitely that's a really good suggestion and good feedback. Okay,
one of the things that immediately comes to mind to me here, along with Laura's question, is looking at something like gateway class for the gateway API, just like a basic something you can reference. So maybe there's like a sync rule class or something where you can specify some common patterns that apply across certain workload types, because yeah, otherwise it could get pretty cumbersome.
I see. Okay. Yep, I'll definitely add that.
I think just another way of thinking of these different strategies, I guess it seems like it depends how much convenience you expect someone to need to apply across multiple types of work API CRs versus like how unique they all really truly are. And I don't know if we have a really good sense on that or not, but that just might be another way to consider all of these different strategies for abstracting the rule set into a more broadly applicable or less broadly applicable package.
Right. So I think the common suggestion from the community and from this call seems to be this here should really be a reference to something else. And then hopefully it can generically take care of either strategy or the policy for the rules. Is that what we're suggesting?
Yeah, I think it's worth investigating, but I don't want to like suppose if you have more data or design background about how unique each work API object really should be when it comes to its sync rules. Like if they're all super different, then the abstractions become less useful. But if they are likely to have more in common, then it becomes really cumbersome to, as you say, do each one individually. So I think if you have any sort of base assumptions about that, that can also help decide if this is a good suggestion, or if it will actually make it just harder for people to configure each individual workload config.
Yep, I think most of the usage so far has been inside of a controller, and most of the time, it's coded once and then it's been taken care of. And it's not really, this work API is not really used on a user basis. So far in our implementation, we have it set this way. But I understand that Honkai and from another project actually have the rules somewhere else as well. So we're just, I think it's up for discussion, and I think it's a good idea to have this reference out anyways, so that we can capture a more generic policy and strategy, because it is quite not traditional to come up with something like this. Are there any more topic before I moved on? Okay, I'm gonna get to going back to, I think, this slide, the alternative one. So this alternative strategy, I actually took it from Honkai's suggestion.
Yeah.
He mentioned that we can do a simpler, user-friendly approach first, where the status data in the work is the same as the applied resource status. So the main concern we have here is the scalability and a potentially large payload. Honkai, do you want to talk a little bit about that, or I should keep going?
I think we can take the actually in Kamada project, we use the raw extension type of status, but we didn't take entire status in it. we use a customer way to store the status. That means user can fully customize what piece of a status should be placed in the field.
I see. Okay. So it's similar to having the sync rules up there, but it's not defined in the API that I'm assuming.
Yes. I think Laura just mentioned the problem is the configuration should not present in the work API. The configuration in the proposal above they should be defined for a kind of resources, not for each work object. For example, there are two work objects. People need to specify two configurations for the work objects. They are a little bit too verbose.
Yes. So yes, that is the I agree with your suggestion, and it seems to be again the common community feedback. The sync rules that we currently have is quite verbose, and I think we're gonna go back and work on that to make sure that is taken care of. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna talk about another alternative quickly. So another alternative to instead of doing this proposal is directly access the API server using proxy to fetch the resource status, but it requires the hub to watch multiple API servers on the spoke or managed clusters, and then the hub also needs to maintain credential for each of them. And watching across cluster might be quite expensive. Example of that can be found, example project that implement this strategy can be found on the cluster live. Okay, I'm gonna do a quick demo of a reference implementation. It's not fully flushed out yet, so, but on the left side, I have a kind hub clusters, a kind cluster that represent the centralized hub cluster that where I'll be applying the work CR. And on my right, I have these spoke clusters that have the work controller that are watching the centralized location. So the examples is the same as what I show in the slide. It's a deployment, and then I have the resource identifier and the status sync, the common fields and the JSON paths. So after I apply the resource on the centralized location on the spoke side, I should be able to get the work deploy. So we can look at the deployment. Look at the deployment status. So these are the common status on the on the deployment resource. So if I look at the status here, we can see the work has been applied, the resource is available, and the status sync, the identifier that identifies the resource with the name and the namespace, and then the status sync values. So once again, the common fields are some of them came from the common fields, and one of them came from the JSON path custom rules. So that is basically it for the current proposal. Are there any additional questions, comments, please feel free to write in the pull request. If not, I think I'm done for the presentation. Thank you, everyone.
All right, and it sounds like you'd like folks to review the pull request and comment on it. Are there any other types of follow-up or requests that you have for folks that are watching now, Mike?
We're also looking for some more feedback on this pull request as well, the add apply work. But we're not sure if it should be a API enhancement or more of a reference implementation. So please take a look at this proposal as well. Thank you.
Can you link that in the meeting notes?
Yes, I will do that.
Awesome. Thank you. Great presentation. Great demo.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Laura, I think you're up next with your API roadshow.
Cool. I will share my screen. Yes. Okay. You guys over there. All right. Cool. So there are two kind of items here. So one thing is I want to give an FYI that last time I gave some info about the About API, which is now in alpha. And we talked a little bit about what sort of the next steps were for it, including if there were other properties that other SIGs or other subprojects might want to use this API for. So just a FYI that myself and Ishmi are going to go to SIGNet and Cluster API, specifically Cluster API this week, and SIGNet is meeting next week to talk about that. So just wanted to give the heads up here that that's when that is scheduled. And that's the news on that. And then the other item here is to talk about some of the beta blockers for both MCS API and Cluster ID, including a follow-up from the last meeting. So I have now made a doc. I know I'm famous for slides, but it has to become time to make a doc of this form, just because we're really getting into the nitty-gritty final parts here. And so I just wanted to bring up that the two main blockers that I'm tracking right now are E2E tests existing for multi-cluster services, and that's kind of a bit nuanced, and I'll go into in a second. And then for cluster ID, determine if the ID property must be strictly a valid DNS label, which is what's written down now, or allowed to be a subdomain. So regarding the E2E tests, and really for both of these, I went and dug up some of our prior conversations since we haven't revisited either of these in a while. So last time we talked about this was actually last December. And what we wanted to do then was actually to either reword this graduation criteria or separate the idea out and figure out if these tests are more like things that implementations need to use or conform to. And at the time we said that we generally thought that maybe this should be decoupled from graduation. And I was supposed to work with Jeremy and Paul on this, which I didn't, so I'm starting now. But this was kind of where we landed before. So I kind of want to just like reopen the floor since it's been a while. I did also dig in directly and just confirmed that of the tests required that are listed in the test plan for the KEP, one exists and two of them don't yet. But since we're discussing how could this instead be used for conformance, or like should this really be E2E test directly against the MCS API reference controller implementation right now, or be more useful for the providers, I think is like the crux of the question. And I'm not exactly sure how to, if we are trying to go more on the make these conformance definitions, how to proceed. So that's my first kind of open floor question. especially for Paul and Jeremy, perhaps, or anybody else who has such experience.
Seems like one of the questions embedded in like your question that you posed or like topic that you offered is what is the analog of conformance in this scenario? Like conformance doesn't exist since we're out of tree. However, MCS is supposed to be an implementation. So I guess sorry, not an implementation, a reference that, or not a reference, an API that you can implement however. So I think it does like provoke the question of exactly what are we testing? Are we establishing a conformance suite that you test against different implementations? Are we doing something else? Like, does that question make sense, whether or not you agree with it, Laura?
Right. No, that does make sense. And I think there's also kind of a seed of like, there is this reference implementation. At this point, there's now like real, I guess, out in the world implementations, which was the direction and purpose of the KEP in the first place. So yeah, I think there's some about like, what is that implementation's like utility and like testing burden on only itself versus something that we can provide and or enforce to the implementation providers, which that is more hazy to me, but that seems like that's more the direction that is valuable. And also just to emphasize again what you said, in the MCS API repo, and even it sort of talks a little bit about like, this is like just the CRD part, but like this is a CRD you can install directly from here, so you can like test your implementations against like the API, but the tests, the end-to-end tests don't provide a similar service. So I think that kind of shows the disconnect too.
I guess one other dimension is that if we think of the test that you're writing as effectively a new conformance suite, like there is the question of what assumptions will that suite make about the topology of the environment where they're being tested. Have you thought about trying to characterize that like, for example, one such set of assumptions could be that you have exactly n number of clusters as a starting point, like so that you can write tests expecting that there are n available as one example. Does that make sense? Have you thought about that?
Like that what we're providing is the like standard of what implementers test suites in the form of, this is a cluster topology you should test for.
I guess to put it another way, in order to test MCS, you need at least 2 clusters, right? You have to test import and export. So would you want to encode in the framing of the suite that there are minimum 2 clusters available? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And there's probably some, I'm not super up on the E2E framework, but I imagine there's, we could provide some sort of test suite generic utility that provides some setup guardrails and even does some of the work. But I don't know how useful that will be to every implementer.
Yeah, I guess one test, like sometimes it's useful to take an example for these kind of like nebulous things, like start with a very concrete example and see what you can learn from that. So for example, if you started with a test that established that service exported from cluster A is imported in cluster B. Like, what does the body of that test look like? What assumptions are like present if you do an exercise where you just don't bother thinking that hard about those kinds of things, and you just try to maybe even write pseudocode for an E2E that establishes that service import and service export work correctly. What can you learn from that? What assumptions were present after you do that first draft of maybe even that pseudocode? What assumptions can you tease out that you may not have been conscious of when you wrote the tests? How do those affect how to frame the prerequisites to run the suite? That if you want to have a test suite that is runnable against any implementation of MCS, that you would need to frame for the purposes of constructing an environment to apply the test to, that's going to fit the assumptions embedded in the suite, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I think maybe you're talking about if we can provide like the middle part, the actual like test, and then provide the, you know, the environment variable that's like cluster A, cluster B, or whatever, and then people can set it up however they want, then we are giving them something useful that they can run to determine that they can form, that they can run in a like sort of agnostic way to their infrastructure, that they conform to MCS API, maybe these three things. Yeah. Okay, and then, yeah, I think that's one version. I think there's a version where like the, you know, these tests should exist in your provider, and we don't provide the middle part explicitly. I think there maybe is a version where we do have those tests, and then we run them on like our side on different supporting providers somehow for real conformance evidence, like from our perspective. And then I think we've pretty much thrown out the like idea of like end-to-end tests on the reference implementation being important for graduation. And
I do think that might be worth, like, that last part about the reference implementation is worth paying a little bit attention to. So I would say that in the presence of an like API spec level conformance suite, I'm not exactly sure how to word it, but like something that would be good to collect is to do or to you know, game out, is to do the exercise of taking the EDEs that are at the conformance level for MCS and applying them to the reference implementation. So taking those EDEs that are written to the spec and saying, what happens when I use those EDEs to validate the reference implementation?
right,
and that
right.
the reference implementation should pass the conformance test.
Okay, hold on, so taking some notes, but I think one thing I particularly directly want to determine too, just from a beta blocker perspective, is whatever variation of this we decide either here or in some coming meetings, should it stay a beta blocker for MCS API?
I am feeling like at this moment, I am feeling like it would make a very strong beta to have these concepts established, even if the test suite is only 3 tests. I think it would be really excellent to like go to beta with that test suite, so that if someone wants to develop their own implementation, they know how to establish, using the test suite, their implementation is conformant to the API spec.
Cool. All right, I think I've captured the thoughts here of how do I capture them all? Okay, so I think it's that.
I was just going to say, I think Jeremy had to drop. I'm extremely curious to know what Jeremy thinks about this too.
Okay, well, we can definitely, I'll leave this open for comment too, because I think there's kind of a bunch of tiers even here. And keep in for beta is the current idea. Okay, but I think if I reorganize this live, this is how my brain is reorganizing right now. I think these specific end-to-end tests directly on the reference implementation what I'm hearing is they're still worth pursuing, since that implementation should still exist and should conform to this suite. And those are potentially the basis of any conformance suite we provide itself anyways.
I'm hearing that your thought process is implement those EDEs against the reference implementation initially, and maybe move them up a level later.
Right. Yeah, that's where my brain is going.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. And then I think what we really want is some level of a conformance suite that people can run against their implementations, because by definition, the MCS API is trying to be a standard, not like the only like centralized implementation. And so I think the tiers of that are to just like, document, like implement these same things, or provide the test, meet itself, and also provide what the assumptions are, and maybe some way to configure the clusters needed on their, whatever the provider is side, so they can run them on their side. And then the most centralized version do that, and also run it on our side against all known implementations somehow. So we can confirm conformance centrally, and I don't know, report on that or something.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. There's certainly like individuals that you could speak to in our community that have experience working through the challenges of doing that last nested bullet point under levels of conformance suite options. There's certainly plenty to learn about how and to what extent that is achieved in KK for Kubernetes level conformance. I think the one last thing that I would say is, like, when we say provide, a way to configure the test, to me, it probably looks like you need to, you as the runner of the test, need to provide at least 2 kube configs.
Right.
Like if n equals 2, you need to provide 2 kube configs.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fundamentally what, for even all the tests that we've already identified, that's the minimum. And yeah, I think that's the format that we would basically require, I guess, that we need 2 kube configs for clusters that are enabled with your version of MCS, however you turn that on your side,
Yep, exactly. And you can do all of that out of band relative to the tests. The interface to the tests is give us kube configs.
Right. Cool. Okay,
and
so
maybe with some namespaces as well. But yeah, that should be sufficient, I think.
Clusters configured with your MCS with like XYZ namespaces, something like that, in ABC clusters. Yeah, the exact numbers, direction, etc., are specific to each of these, and I think can be backed out of course. Okay, cool. I invite comments directly on this doc as well, or DMs, but does anybody here have other comments right now about this concept? I'm going to slide down. The other thing I wanted to bring up was follow up from last time about the question on whether the ID, aka the cluster name for a cluster in this about API, should it be strictly a valid DNS label or is it allowed to be a subdomain? And we talked about this last June. And at that point, we were trending towards labels because we didn't have a specific use case for subdomains. And in that meeting, someone back channeled with someone in Cluster API being sort of the our predecessor in going down this road with many providers, that their cluster names are labels, not subdomains. However, I don't see any strict definition or enforcement of that in CAPI. And like I took a look at like the Azure provider, but I definitely have an untrained eye. So since I'm going to Cluster API Office Hours Smart anyways, I'm bringing you as a question there. But this is me sort of redigging up our prior research and thoughts about this. And I think at that point we were pretty settled on labels, but want to open that up now, and then also am doing this cross check that may provide us the most seasoned data on this. Yeah, so I'll kind of leave the floor here for if we think there's a different direction I should go, but I'm trending stick with labels and just double check with CAPI tomorrow. Cool. Okay,
Right.
great. Yeah, those are the two main blockers that I wanted to get confirmation / conversation going with everybody here. Feel free to comment on or talk in this doc to if there's anything else I'm missing or if you have any other comments. But this is the status today and the nitty gritty details of the last bits. The end.
All right. I think that's the end of our agenda today. Thank you, everybody. See you next time. If you have anything you'd like to share with the group, and I'll just reiterate what we say in the KubeCon deep dive, which is it is wonderful to share problems that you have no solutions for. We'd love to know what you're struggling with. We'd love to know what you're doing about it, but you don't need to tell us what you're doing about it or even know what to do about it to share it. We'd just love to know. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. See you next time.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.